Well, 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 it looks to me like it's 930. As in Ryzen 930, the 9950X and the 9900X are launching tomorrow for retail. You'll be able to buy them. It's 12 and 16 cores on the desktop. I just remember it was only yesterday that I was super excited about 16 cores on the desktop. This is Ryzen Threadripper. Remember Ryzen Threadripper? 16 cores, 4 memory channels, all those PCIe lanes, and both of these processors, 12 and 16 cores, absolutely run circles around and demolish the 1950X Threadripper. Now the Ryzen 5 and the Ryzen 7 CPUs for Zen 5 have already launched, and 5 is alive and well. Zen 5. From Zen and Zen Plus to Zen 5 and Zen 5 and Zen 5 and 12 and 16 cores. The big question though is, are the 12 and the 16 core parts a little more attractive than their 6 and 8 core counterparts? Well, that's why you're here, isn't it? We need to actually dive in and figure that out. Well, it's a closer look at the benchmarks time, right? Well, let's start out with Cinebench 2024, because this one should be an easy win for the 9000 series CPUs, right? Oh, and look at that. The 9950X with its 16 cores of glorious awesomeness is right on top. Single core and multi-core score. 16 cores outperforming 24 cores of the 14900K. Handily, I might add. Even the single core score is higher. Now, the CPU-Z, our single core speed is just a hair slower than that 14900K, but our multi-core score is a little higher. 16 versus 24 cores. E-core's not quite getting it done in 2024. But, I mean, you know, 14900K to have come out a while ago, this is actually a pretty good result. And the 9900X, 871 single core score, and 12,959. This is scaling appropriately, 12 versus 16 cores. Puget Bench on the 9950X, 16 cores, PBO on, 11,189. And with PBO off, 10,893. 5% uplift, PBO off to PBO off, but PBO on, that's a pretty good uplift. 6.1% with PBO on, PBO for PBO. The extended Puget Bench test for Premiere Pro, benchmark version 1.01, 11,057. Again, quite an uplift. Our Geekbench 6 scores, 3384 and 21295. What I want to know is, what does PBO look like? 3424 and 22206 for the multi-core score. This is definitely weighted heavily for things this processor can do, which are a little bit more of a server context. Now, if you're wondering about server tasks or server-ish tasks or even Linux workstation tasks, be sure to check out our Linux review where we cover that a little more in depth. This is a very strange launch because Windows, it seems, is lagging behind Linux just a little bit. I mean, this is not something that I can really capture and communicate in benchmarks yet. It took me a little by surprise. But it seems like there are some games that perform better on Linux that are designed for Windows than on Windows natively. In fact, I think that Windows is not doing something correctly with these CPUs. The memory benchmarks are that we saw in the Ryzen 5 and the Ryzen 7 launch only tell part of the story. And the memory benchmarks does show a little bit of a regression on both Linux and Windows. So that may be something in the platform that needs to be ironed out. But that aside, there are still some odd performance anomalies in Windows that I can't quite explain. And I'm not really sure what that means. For example, if we look at Cyberpunk 2077, and we cycle through a couple of different configurations with a couple of different benchmarks, I can get 185 FPS with 103 FPS as our average. Now here's the weird thing. In Windows, if I run the program as administrator, I can get 197 FPS. It's a 10 FPS uplift at 1080p. I'm also disabling memory core isolation in Windows, which is a security feature, and I'm not really sure what to make of that. So the results presented here are with the possibility that maybe Windows is doing something strange. I'm really not sure. For 1440p, it's a similar story. We're basically looking at 150 FPS across the board, no matter what we're running. The 9950X does come out on top here for 1440p versus 4K. And I can even squeeze a little bit more out of this with 160 FPS playing some tricks in Windows. You can do process lasso to pin things for SMT. You can set a process priority. You can run it as administrator. Little things like that make a bigger difference than I would expect, specifically with Cyberpunk. The built-in benchmark in Cyberpunk is also not fabulous, but it's at least repeatable. With no ray tracing, the 14900K comes out on top at 4K for some reason. I don't know. That's really weird. We need to retest this one. The 9950X shows up with 72 FPS with PBO. This is also another thing with like the 7700X versus the 9700X in the previous review. I think PBO doesn't really make a big difference. The CPU is efficient enough that PBO doesn't really add anything to the equation when we're talking about game performance, because PBO just gives the CPU more watts. But the CPU doesn't need more watts to perform better in a game. The bottleneck is elsewhere. And it's kind of a similar story with our 16-core CPUs. PBO on 9950X, PBO off 1 or 2 FPS. Not a huge difference. But this is another one where at 4K with no ray tracing, I can get up around 90 FPS if I play with how Windows is executing this game. It's maddening and it's frustrating. Still looking into that. It's probably going to be another video. Now for ray tracing and the Ultra preset, 1080p ray tracing, the 9950X comes in third with 122 FPS, 86 FPS for our 1% lows. At 1440, everything is 81 to 85 FPS. Basically, any of these modern CPUs would be an amazing gameplay experience, but the 9950X with PBO on 82 FPS. That's awesome. 46 FPS to 40 FPS is our range, and the 9950X comes in third. Not bad. 43 FPS. Not going to be your bottleneck at 4K with ray tracing. Now, while actually playing Cyberpunk 2077, I noticed some interesting things. First off, understand that if you have the 12 or the 16-core dual CCD part from AMD, they have new software that enables core parking. Core parking is a technology that notices when you're playing a game and helps make sure that the game is scheduled on one CCD. And that does make a big difference in game performance for a lot of games, but not every game. Some game actually does have optimizations in it to look at how it runs and how it's scheduled, and some games really just leave it to the operating system. And Windows is still not great. Even though, you know, Intel's got their big cores and little cores, and AMD has their cross-CCD stuff, the internal engineering in Windows still, it leaves a lot to be desired. And it is still possible to use software like Process Lasso that we've covered in years gone by and eke out a few more percentage points in terms of performance. Well, if you disable SMT, symmetric multithreading, which is actually a pretty important technology on these CPUs and get a lot of free performance from multithread, if you disable it, a lot of games, the performance will actually improve. This is the first place that I noticed this when I was experimenting with AMD's core parking thing. Why does everything have to... I just want to sit down and play some games. I don't want to think about this. Why does this have to be so complicated? Of course, on Intel, you don't even have SMT on your E-cores. You've only got it on your performance cores. 8 cores, 16 threads, plus whatever. And then on the AMD side, we've got 16 real full fat cores plus 16 threads. Now, it's still the case that AMD seems to bend one of the CCDs to be a better CCD and one that uses a little less power, so one of them gets more power than the other. And actually, if you run a single-thread benchmark like Cinebench, and you look at the power consumption, the whole CPU power consumption with just one thread can be as high as 60 watts, which is comparable to what we see on Alder Lake and Raptor Lake from Intel, which I found pretty interesting. Now, if you go multi-core, obviously, you know, 16 times 60 watts is an impossible situation. But, and so the power usage comes down and the performance comes down a little bit. Also managing the heat becomes a problem. But this is also, you know, this is true, the Intel platform as well. And that's just how things are built these days. But still, it was really interesting to see. The improvements in Ryzen Master were also pretty strong with the curve optimizer and PBO finding the sweet spot for this particular CPU. The 9950X I tested on both the Arctic Freezer liquid cooling solution, actually Liquid Freezer 2 or 3. Arctic's got some really killer stuff, as well as a Be Quiet tower cooler with 2 fans. And the tower cooler, of course, you know, immediately you're going to see that go to 95 degrees C, especially when we're looking at Cinebench or something like that. But again, these CPUs are designed to be able to tolerate running at 95 degrees C for 24/7, at least according to AMD specifications. So okay, sounds good. But if you want more performance and you want PBO, then obviously it would be better to have better cooling. But don't feel like you have to have insanely crazy cooling, because the overall power utilization on these CPUs is relatively modest for the amount of performance that you get. The spread on some of these benchmarks, depending on the Windows configuration, is alarming. I'm not 100% sure that this version of Windows is handling Zen 5, because on certain games, like Cyberpunk, I mean, there is an SMT setting in the settings for Cyberpunk, but that's a red herring. That's not part of this. It's possible to get Cyberpunk to run at like 230 FPS 1080p high, which handily outperforms the 14900K, but not always. And it may depend on disabling Windows security features, which is not like, I'm not saying that you should have to disable Windows security features to do something. I'm saying that something is not configured right somewhere. I don't know. There wasn't enough time to really figure that out. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of updates and a lot of other stuff happening, you know, once the new thing gets launched. We'll revisit it in a couple of weeks. I don't know what to tell you. Oh, and another major improvement that I want to talk about is the memory situation with 4 DIMMs. And this seems to also be a positive improvement for Ryzen 7000 series CPUs as well. I did some limited testing on 7000 series AM5 CPUs. But for the 9000 series, you know, officially AMD still only supports DDR5 3600. That is unchanged. Remember, with 2 DIMMs, you can run DDR5 5600. That's an improvement from 5200 over their older AM5 counterparts. 5600 is a JEDEC standard, and that is very nice to see, and hallelujah. Are you going to be able to run DDR5 6000 on 4 DIMMs? No. Not reliably, not in my experience. Even still with the new platform and the newest, you know, that's not going to change even with 800 series motherboards. It's just not going to happen. It's too problematic for DDR5. The sweet spot for no headaches is 2 48 gig DIMMs right now. That aside, if you do want to run 4 DIMMs, it does work better than DDR5 3600 in my experience. 4500 or 4400, 4800 is probably achievable if you're willing to put in a little bit of work. The first thing is you should have 4 matched DIMMs. But even if you get 4 matched DIMMs, it's not necessarily a kit of 4. Like, I think it's actually impossible to look for a kit of 4. But if you get 2 kits of 2, the way that you should lay your memory out in this thing is actually like this. So if I get 2 identical kits of memory, they should actually be in the same channel, not different channels. And even the same part number, even everything else. And this is true of both, you know, the Intel and the AMD platform, but this is something that has become especially true with DDR5. It may not make a difference if they are actually exactly identical, but a lot of the time now with binning and pairing and everything else, there can be really tiny, minuscule differences between DIMMs, even that have the same part number. And so having the 2 identical DIMMs in a single channel is a higher chance, a higher recipe for success. And you'd be surprised the little weird issues you can run into if you do that. Now, with the coming 800 series chipsets, there may be better tools in the BIOS to help you find the optimal tuning parameters, even though the DDR5 memory is not going to be clocked as high because you are running 4 DIMMs. But does that mean that our mythological future of 192 gigabytes being reasonably stable on the AM5 platform is attainable? Preliminary testing for this on the 9950X and the 9900X shows, yeah, that might actually be viable. We might actually be able to do that at 4800 with an overclock, and that is a substantial overclock. So just temper your expectations that 4 DIMMs at DDR5 6000 being 24/7 stable, probably still not a thing, but it is a dramatic improvement over what it was in the prior generation AM5, and head and shoulders better than what I've experienced on Intel, even with the W680 platform. So, good job, AMD. The other thing that wasn't quite ready on launch, I think, was DDR5 8000. So I've got DDR5 8000 48 gig to 24 gig sticks from both Team Group and G-Skill, and these kits of memory are fabulous. So one of the things we saw at AMD Tech Day was being able to run DDR5 memory at 8000 and configuring it so that, you know, your Infinity Fabric dividers and everything else kind of still makes sense. That doesn't seem to be a part of the X670E motherboard BIOSes yet. You can kind of sort of manually dial it in, but it's not easy to just change a couple of settings in the BIOS and get it to post to DDR5 8000. Or at least it's not in a state that I would expect normal people who buy a DDR5 8000 kit to do. And this is a launch day review, so if you're watching this at some point way far in the future, this is probably fixed now, because 6400 with a fabric speed of 2133 was a possibility for me. And that was another trick that I could use to improve gaming performance for some games, being able to run the fabric at 2133 but still have that 1-to-1-to-1 ratio between the Infinity Fabric and the memory ratio and the internal machinery inside Zen 5. That's still a thing that still applies. And with a little bit of tuning, I was able to achieve a latency floor of 69 nanoseconds for the memory latency. Although the bandwidth wasn't as high, at 72 nanoseconds latency, I could achieve 80 gigabytes per second, which is a personal best for not spending a lot of time trying to really dial in the Zen timings. So 80 gigabytes per second with 72 nanoseconds latency, yeah, for a lot of games at 1080p, that is a significant performance uplift. There's not much performance uplift for 1440p and 4K for those settings, but maybe that's a portent of things to come when you've got a bunch of L3 cache in the X3D parts to hide memory latency a little more effectively. I don't know. We'll see. Assassin's Creed Mirage. This is a good showing here for the 9950X, 166 FPS. 158 FPS with PBO off. And this is the ultra high preset. At 1440, the spread is 149 FPS to 163 FPS. The 9950 coming in at 159 FPS, and the 9900X coming in at 150 FPS. Again, modern processors, gameplay experience, the core parking thing that AMD has done is doing like it should. At 4K, the spread is 119 FPS to 130 FPS. The performance of the 7950X and the 9950X are neck and neck on this benchmark. I didn't have time to investigate Assassin's Creed Mirage to see if it suffers from the strange Windows performance anomalies, but maybe. Counter-Strike 2, the performance is very, very similar to our 9900X, 368 FPS. It's a little better with PBO on and PBO off. It's a very good showing for CS2, especially when we're, 1080p. At 1440p on the very high preset, our spreads 339 to 402. 358 FPS for the 9950X with PBO on versus 347 with PBO off. At 4K, the situation changes a little bit. The 9950X dominates everything with 287 FPS. Okay, basically everything is 280-ish FPS when we're talking about maximum scores at 4K in Counter-Strike 2. There's really not a lot of spread here. But the 9950X does take the lead with PBO on. Starfield 1080, our spreads 136 to 148. There's really nothing unusual going on here. 146 FPS for PBO on with our 9950X. Our 9900X is a very respectable 137 FPS. These CPUs are amazing for gaming, but if you're buying the 12 or the 16 core, I hope you're doing more than just gaming. 1440, the spread's 118 to 131 FPS. The 9900X is on the bottom with only 118 FPS. Gosh, I don't know if you could slum it with just 118 FPS. If it is, maybe you can upgrade to the 9950X with 131 FPS. And at 4K, it's much the same story. 92 FPS for the 9950X. And the 9900X with PBO off is 78 FPS. I am surprised that the PBO on scores at 4K are as high as they are. I would not have expected that given the performance of the 9700X with PBO on. I wonder if it's because the 9950X has just a little higher lightly threaded boost clocks. That's something I should probably look into a little more. Horizon Forbidden West at 1080p, very high preset, 172 to 190 FPS is our spread. But man, look at those 1% and 0.1% lows on the 9950X. It's a very steady gameplay experience, even though it is tied for first with the 14900K. I would say that because of the 1% and the 0.1% lows in this specific game at 1080, this is a better result. The PBO off score, 178 FPS with a 115 and 126 for our 0.1% and our 1% lows. Not quite as compelling, but still a very, very good result. For 1440p, it's 140 to 168 FPS spread. The 9950X coming out on top. And a very respectable showing from the 9900X. At 4K, the spread's 94 to 117 FPS. I'm surprised there's that much difference between the PBO off 9900X and the 9950X 16 core with PBO on, but hey, what are you going to do? For our other artificial benchmarks like 3D Mark, looking at the CPU profile and looking at Firestrike, these CPUs show a much more significant uplift than you see, really, I think, in real-world gaming. but this maybe gives you an idea of how much headroom there is here possibly with driver and operating system updates in the future. Usually I like to do the artificial benchmarks first, but these results in the artificial benchmarks being so far ahead of like a real world gameplay improvements, especially over Zen 4, I think give us some more hope for the future in terms of how much things have improved. I mean, if you look at the launch of, the Intel 13900K and the 14900K, which is basically the same CPU, which is a little extra paprika to just make it just a little different. The software improved things almost as much as from 13th to 14th generation. But here with AMD, we have a totally new microarchitecture that is paving the way for the future. Zen 5 is a very forward-looking architecture. And so even though there are certain applications that don't show as much of an uplift from Zen 4 to Zen 5 does lay the foundation and the groundwork for Zen 6 and a lot of future updates. And already in Linux, I'm seeing tremendous performance uplift for specific applications. And I think that if we're able to take better advantage of those micro-architectural changes to the processor in pedestrian operating systems like Windows, you're going to feel it. You're going to see a difference in just everyday usage of the system. Heck, consumer applications making use of AVX 512, which has gone away with Alder, Raptor, and Raptor Lake Refresh CPUs, is kind of a big deal. And to say nothing of the branch predictor, which should convey tremendous performance uplift in Windows. Not sure if we need an update for that. Maybe. Bottom line, what's the deal on the 9900X and the 9950X? Zen 5 is really cooking. If you are on Zen 2, it's time to upgrade. Zen 5 is a worthy upgrade, I think. If you are on Zen 3, it's probably also time to upgrade. Except maybe the 5800X 3D. If you are interested in a purely gaming workload, you're probably going to be better off waiting for the X3D variant of Zen 5. Heck, you could probably get a fire sale Zen 4 CPU with an AM5 combo. 7800X3D, it is hard to beat the 7800X3D for gaming and everything else, depending on what you're doing with the game and how it's running and some other details. But generally, the 7800X3D is a solid CPU for gaming. There's also a lot of other CPUs on sale because other competing CPUs are now more mainstream. They've been out for a year. They're older. There's a little bit of a supply glut. The prices come down a fair bit. And so there are a lot of deals to be had in the market and everywhere else. So if you're looking to build a gaming machine at the end of 2024, you have a lot of very solid options for putting something together. For me, I'm more interested in productivity and multitasking and running a ton of background applications. And for me, that means that I need at least 24 threads. I need really more than 24 threads. Like, that would be nice if I had more than 24 threads. And so looking at the 12 and the 16 core CPUs that have more than 12 cores, basically, is sort of the only place that I want to look. And yeah, it is true that you get into weird situations where a 7800X3D with its 8 cores and 16 threads can outperform a 12 or a 16 core. Even the 7950X3D, like the 7800X3D for some games, performs better than the 16 core. And it was just because of juggling resources and operating system limitations that have to do with getting everything in the right place on the CPU and getting that to run really well. And we see that a little bit, I think, with Zen 5, because Zen 5 is so new and the micro-architectural improvements. Linux does seem to be in a better position to take advantage of the new Zen 5 micro-architecture than Windows at this time. But Windows is being updated all the time, and I think that we will see updates in Windows that are better able to take advantage of Zen 5, but you shouldn't buy a CPU today on a promise of functionality tomorrow. So be sure to check out our Linux review, but on the Windows side of things, Zen 5 is actually looking pretty good. It's just not AMD's usual, like, 20% and bells and whistles upgrade. But this is still a really solid upgrade for basically any machine that you would be running that's more than 3 years old. And that is nice to see. And it is also nice to see that AMD has become the most amazing, boring execution machine in terms of generational uplift and improvement and so on and so forth. And that they're able to do this with a totally new microarchitecture instead of just refreshing Zen 4 is also refreshing. See what I did there? I'm Wendell, this is Level 1. I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forums if I've missed anything. But man, this review and the testing for this and being a little bit on a compressed time schedule, especially with some late breaking stuff that happens with this, we're going to have another follow-up video pretty much immediately. Fun times. All right, I'm Wendell. I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forums.